Hey everybody, it's Eric from EP Autos, your libertarian car guy, and it's time for another rant. And today I'd like to rant about electric cars, and I'm going to tell you some things that you may not have heard and probably never will hear from mainstream automotive journalists who, for a variety of reasons, either don't want to or are incapable of telling you the true poop about electric cars. They get a lot of positive press. And rarely does anybody actually question them on practical or economic grounds, and that's exactly what I'm going to do now. First, I want to give you a little bit of context. Electric cars are by no means new technology. In fact, electric cars have been around for more than 100 years. Some years ago, I was invited up to the Hemmings Motor News Museum in Bennington, Vermont, and they have a museum up there, and they opened up the museum, a car museum, and let journalists like myself drive a lot of the old cars that they have there, and that was a real treat. One of the cars that I got to drive was a Baker Electric, circa 1908, around that time frame. I can't recall because it's been about 10 years, but at least 100 years old electric car. And the basic technology of that Baker Electric from 100 years ago is more or less the same technology that's in use today. Specifically, the real problem is, or the limiting factor, I should say, with electric cars is battery technology. And yes, they've evolved from lead acid to nickel metal hydride, lithium ion, and various other types of batteries. But I've been a journalist writing about cars for a long time, since the early 1990s, and I've had the opportunity to drive virtually every electric car that's been more than just an engineering demonstration project, and that includes the EV1, for those who remember back in the 90s, the GM electric car, also called the Impact. Then the Ford EcoStar, which was one that had a sodium sulfur, which is a hot battery. It actually operates at several hundred degrees Fahrenheit, and if it cools off, it solidifies and you're stuck. Anyway, they have been working on batteries for longer than I've been alive. I'm in my 40s. So it's been 100 plus years that they've been trying to make battery technology functionally and economically competitive with gasoline. Think about gas. One of the things about gas that makes it so hard to compete with is you can take a gallon of this liquid and you can pour this liquid into a tank of a car, and you can travel these days about 40 miles on that gallon of fuel without any trouble. And when it's time to add more fuel, well, you just pour in another gallon, and it literally takes moments to do that. Very straightforward. With electric cars, on the other hand, you have to store the electricity in these batteries. And as the battery discharges from the electric motors drawing current to power the car and move it forward, it gets depleted, and after a certain point, a relatively short point, you have to stop and recharge the batteries. And even with these so-called fast chargers that they've developed, you may have heard of that, which up the voltage from typical 110 or 115 volt household to 220 or 240 volts. They have cut the recharge times down, but you're still talking about minimally, even with the best performing systems, about 45 minutes to an hour to put a partial charge back in the vehicle. And if you don't have access to one of these high output chargers, and they're very uncommon and they're expensive, you have to have them put into your home or put into your business. They're not like gas stations that you can find anywhere. Anyway, if you don't have access to one of those and the batteries start to go on you, then you plug into standard household current, in which case it takes hours, typically 8 hours or more, to restore the batteries. And that's extremely problematic all by itself, but it's made all the more problematic by the fact that the range of these electric cars is not even close to the range of something even like this big gas hog Infiniti QX that I'm driving. This thing will go on a full tank. It gets about 8 to 10 miles per gallon in the way I drive it, but I could still get 200 something miles out of this thing the way I drive it. Best case with an electric car, and that includes the Tesla, is around 100 miles, and that's optimistic. That's assuming ideal conditions, meaning when it comes to electric cars, that you don't accelerate too aggressively, that you maintain fairly low speeds, meaning around 50, 55 miles an hour, and ideally less than that. And here's the kick in the nuts: don't use electrically powered accessories, for example, air conditioning and heat, which in an electric car are powered by, you guessed it, the same batteries that propel the car, because there's no gas engine to do those things for you. So if you run the air conditioner or operate the heat and the fan, That cuts into the range. To give you some sense of how bad it is, the delivery service that handles the press vehicles for journalists like me wanted to send me an electric Golf. Volkswagen has an e-Golf, that's what it's called, available this year. Problem is that the e-Golf they found, and this is inside baseball, I'm not going to name names, but it only goes about 60 miles, they tell me, before it conks out and has to be recharged. And for them to drive the vehicle down here would essentially mean that they have to stop about a third of the way from where the press fleet is headquartered up in the DC area, stop, recharge the car, drive another 60 miles, stop, and probably would have to do that 3 or maybe 4 times, which is just ridiculous, and that's why they haven't brought me an e-Golf. And that's probably also why Tesla has not sent me a car, because I would probably expose the truth about the Tesla. And speaking of the Tesla, let me segue a little bit and talk about the Tesla some. Most of the reports that you probably have seen on TV or read in newspapers and magazines typically tout the performance of the top-of-the-line model, the one that starts well over 6 figures. And that car does accelerate very quickly, and under optimal conditions, it has, for an electric vehicle, a reasonable range. But let's talk about the regular Tesla, the inexpensive one, the one that starts at about $70,000. Which is not shy, by the way, from what you pay for a top-of-the-line conventional car. Anyway, that thing only has a range of about 100 miles, and its performance is pretty mediocre, at least in context of what else is available for the money. It does 0 to 60 in about 5.5 seconds, the Tesla. A couple of weeks ago, I tested out a new Mustang with the 4-cylinder turbo EcoBoost engine, and that little Mustang scuttles to 60 more quickly than the base Tesla, and it doesn't cost $70,000 either. You can pick one up for $26,000, and yeah, the Tesla doesn't use any gas, but so what? You just saved yourself. Let's see, the Mustang costs about $26,000, so you do the math. I'm a little bit slow. I think it's about $35,000 price difference. You figure out how long you'd have to drive to make up that $35,000 difference in price. The long and short of it is, people have accused me, after having read my columns about electric cars, of being anti-electric cars and anti-hybrids, and that's absolutely not the case. I'm all for the technology if it can stand on its own 2 legs or 4 tires, or however you'd like to characterize it. My issue is twofold. One, I don't like being made to subsidize failure. That's the first thing. If these cars can't be sold on the merits, if they're not sufficiently capable, if they don't perform, if they aren't cost effective, then they shouldn't be out there. That's the bottom line. And more fundamentally, there's this business of the opportunity cost. By subsidizing these failed efforts, we will never know what might have been developed if the market had been allowed to operate. If there were no subsidies for electric cars, or hybrids for that matter, if it were the market that determined the success or failure, there would be strong inducement for whoever wanted to build one of these types of vehicles to get it right. To build an electric car that actually not only outperforms a conventional car, but outperforms it economically. Who cares how quick it is if it costs 3 times as much as a comparably quick car? For an electric car to be viable, it's got to be as reliable, as versatile, as capable as an otherwise equivalent gas engine car, and it has to be price competitive with the gas engine car. And until that happens, this whole thing is nothing more than Soviet-style corporatist rent-seeking propping up of failed industries. And as glitzy and as sexy as some of these things are, that's the bottom line. And don't be bamboozled by it, and don't listen to what the mainstream journalists tell you, because they're not telling you the true scoop, the true facts, and I will. At any rate, we will catch up with you later. If you have any thoughts or comments, please come down to epautos.com, post them there. We'd love to hear from you, and we will catch up with you the next